talking about RAID is great, but actually doing RAID is a whole different game. So in this episode, we're going to actually set up some RAID arrays. Now, I need to be careful here because there's really two different ways to do RAID. First is what we call software RAID. When we talk about software RAID, we're talking about telling the operating system, telling Windows, telling Linux, telling OS X that I've got all these drives in here, please set up RAID. The other way is hardware RAID. With hardware RAID, we're going to have some type of controller, something built into our system that actually sets up the RAID arrays. And when it's done with those arrays, it presents those arrays as just one big volume to the operating system itself. Now, there's a number of different ways to do hardware RAID, but we're going to do it in this episode in what I'm going to call firmware RAID. We're going to take advantage of a motherboard that has built-in RAID functionalities to actually set the RAID up for us. So to do that, what I want to do is show you my initial setup. So it looks something like this. What I've got is 4 hard drives, and I like labeling them. When you're doing RAID arrays, you usually use identical drives if you can, so I like labeling them. It's just me, so I label them A, B, C, and D. Each one of these drives is a 1.8 terabyte SATA drive. Now, if you take a look, you'll see all of those, it's kind of hard to see here, but they're all plugged into SATA ports right down here on my motherboard. And then if you take a look over here to the left, you'll see that this is my M.2 drive. This is my boot drive. It's got Windows on it. It boots up, so that's just one big C drive, and I'm going to be putting arrays after the C drive. All right, so that's my basic setup. So I've got one drive in here, and I've got 4 new drives that I'm going to be making all kinds of different RAID arrays from. Okay, now that sounds really easy, right? We'll just go buy 4 hard drives and plug them in. Well, it's not that easy, friends. First of all, figuring out exactly how to configure my system for RAID took a little bit of work. I had to go through this motherboard book 8 Ways to Sunday to figure out exactly how to do it. There were a lot of little issues, like, for example, if I have an M.2 drive in there, one of those SATA ports just turns itself off automagically. The bottom line is you've got to go through your motherboard documentation. I know you can't read this. Let's get a close-up. So you enjoy reading that documentation and see how well you can figure it out. Yeah, I know it can be a bit of a challenge, but the nice part is if you take your time and poke around and organize yourself, speaking of organization, this is actually a little quick sketch of my 6 different SATA ports on the back of my system, and I use this sketch to help me keep track of which drive A, B, C, or D is plugged into where. So let's get a close-up of this too. Little sketches like this can really be handy. The bottom line is that don't be afraid to try things a little bit. With a new RAID array, the chances of you breaking anything is just about 0. The chances of you plugging something in wrong and it doesn't work, well, that's going to happen. Just unplug it and try something else. Experiment until all the drives appear. Now, speaking of drives appearing, in this particular system, I'm going to use my system setup to actually configure all the different drives. So let's take a look at my system setup. First of all, if you scroll through this a little bit, you can see there's my SSD up at the top where it says Samsung SSD. And as we go through, you can see some of the hard drives. All these WDC, those are all my Western Digital drives. And right now they're set up as regular drives. And what I want to do is say, no system, I want RAID. So on this particular system, I go from AHCI to RAID. And if I'm doing everything exactly right, all I need to do at this point is reboot the system, come back into my system setup, and if I've done it right, I'll see those 4 drives ready to be formed as new RAID arrays. So I've got everything now set up, so hopefully if I've done this right, we should see our 4 new SATA drives ready to be formed into an array. And on this particular system, I learned that I have to go to the Intel Rapid Storage Technology, and there they are. Now, be careful here because we have 5 drives. Remember, I have that one M.2 drive, which is my boot drive, and I certainly do not want to do anything to that drive. But you can see on the screen here on SATA 1, 2, 4, and 5, my 4 1.8 terabyte drives. That means I've done a good job. On this particular system, up at the top, it just says create RAID volume. So what I'm going to do this time is I'm just going to make a stripe. And in this particular example with my RAID 0 stripe, I'm just going to use 2 drives. If you take a look here, it says it's a stripe. Now if I wanted to change it, here's where I could do that, but I'm going to stick with stripe for right now. And I'm just going to pick 2 arbitrary drives. So I've selected the 2 drives. I hit create volume, and I have just made a RAID 0. Of course, that's no fun. Let's go ahead and kill that. Delete. Good. Yes, all data will be lost. Let's do it again. Now this time, well, RAID 0 is too easy. Let's go ahead and do RAID 5. In this case, I'm going to come down. I'm going to select RAID 5. And just to make it more fun, I'm going to use 4 drives. And I'm going to make myself a RAID 5 array using 4 drives. And there it is. So I've made this beautiful RAID 5 array using 4 hard drives. In order to take advantage of it though, what we need to do is boot up the operating system. Now in this case I want to use Windows. So if we were to boot up Windows and go into disk management, you'd see something like this. We've now set up the RAID array. Understand that Windows knows nothing about this. Anything we have to do in terms of dealing with this particular array has to be handled at the BIOS level. Now, there are lots of utilities out there that you'll see that you can actually run in the operating system to take care of stuff, but it is really, for the most part, completely separated from the operating system itself. Speaking of operating system RAID, what I would recommend you do at this point is go check out my software RAID episode to do a compare and contrast between doing RAID the hardware way versus doing it the software way.